Hi, folks. Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. And thank you for joining this audio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about and it's looking likely, I'm sure the globalists will do everything they can to stop it, fair means or foul, but it's looking increasingly like there'll be a Trump presidency coming up at the end of this year. Now, the globalists have been using US power, so being the biggest economy in the world and having the most influence, controlling the reserve currency, all this sort of thing. They've been using the US power to effectively create a power cartel in pushing and forcing globalization and the globalization type policies. When I say globalization, I don't mean that they talk about global trade. It's not that. Using strong arm tactics to impose ideological type globalist positions on other countries, not to do with trade or trade used as a weapon. But so let's have a little look at that. The US has been using. The globalists have been using the US as a power center to enforce globalization on the rest of the world. The unwilling and the half willing, the part willing, and so on. But when did I first come across this? Well, I think it was in the early 1990s. I was and I've mentioned this previously, I was on a plane flight, I think from New York or somewhere around there to Boston maybe, but somewhere in the Northeast to Texas. And then there was a connecting flight from, I think it was Dallas, Fort Worth, or as the Americans call DFW, to go to the Caribbean. And the guy I was sitting next to in first class was a guy who's part of the Caribbean, some Caribbean island. I can't remember which one now. I didn't actually pay much notice at the time, but I did remember the encounter. And he was part of the trade negotiating team that had come to New York to negotiate or be dictated to, probably more to the point, on what the new trade deal for his impoverished island was. Now, he was a member of the wealthy few families that controlled the Caribbean island, and he was the son of one of the local goons, really, or warlords, or whatever you call them, but he was quite surprised. He still was in a state of bewilderment. Now, he's clearly out of his element. I don't think he'd ever done anything official before in his life. He'd vacationed around the place, and he obviously came from a well-to-do, corrupt mafia-like family. But he was coming to the US because they were going to negotiate a trade deal for the island. And he was of the view that it would be a negotiation, it would be about trade. But instead, and again, this is where he was bewildered, and he mentioned this to me, and still really in a state of bewilderment. And the meeting must have been a few days earlier, because as I recall, he decided to hang around in New York, taking a couple of Broadway shows, that sort of stuff. So he explained that along these lines, they'd gone to the negotiation. Instead, these tough guys, were dictating to the, you're this little shitbox Caribbean island, some bullshit backwater, and we will dictate to you how it's going to be. And so there was a various mixture. They grew, they grew sugar on the island. The Americans agreed to buy it and that sort of stuff. So, and pay above the card for the sugar, also to make sure that American cruise ships, coming out of Miami and so on, would stop there and disgorge lots of cashed up American tourists to spend money there. Tourism was a pretty big deal for the island. They would give the go ahead for another hotel to be built there, which would create jobs for the locals, this sort of stuff. Now, given how poor the islands are, then these sort of things are pretty essential. But I think most of the wealth that's generated by things would just go to a handful of corrupt, tribal goon type families anyway. Nonetheless, the guy has just assumed it would be a trade negotiation, but they were told that you have to create divorce courts. You have to make sure, you have to create a child support agency. You have to create a special agency to support lesbian women and so all the LGBTQ stuff. You have to create race hustling, gender hustling, LGBTQ. You have to create all the organs and all the instruments that can be used to create all this hustling, this clamoring for equality and equity. And so they were being forced to put all this in. And it was not like, would you please do it or this or that. They were being told, like, you will do it or else. And so they wanted these islands that are irrelevant to anything, to create this race and gender and sexuality type hustling under the threat and pain of losing all trade deals with the United States. Now, these little impoverished islands, they're fucked without these trade deals and without American largesse, in effect. So the Americans were, at least, or the trade negotiators or trade dictators, were demanding that the islands, that this island will, you will do this or else. But the weirdest things. Another thing that they would, the guy was amazed by. Some Americans, not very many, I mean a handful of them really, were escaping paying child support in America by moving to these islands. And so the American government was insisting that the special treaty had to be put in place so that these Americans escaping onerous and outrageous child support obligations, alimony obligations, that sort of stuff that's being imposed on them by a corrupt kangaroo court, would go to these islands and they could be extradited and that there should be a treaty so that American FBI agents could come and get them and stick it up them, and the local police would arrest them and put them in prison and this sort of, the guy was, he said, why would they give a shit about that? What's that got to do with anything? And so he'd gone there somewhat naively, I think, but he'd gone to the US, or New York in this case, to negotiate what he thought was a trade deal. In fact, it was being imposed upon him or on the island's government, that this is what you will do. So these were all the building blocks of the globalist project: race hustling, gender hustling, sexuality hustling, LGBTQ, all this sort of stuff. And it was being that they must do it under, again, pain of great economic suffering if they didn't do it. Now, I mean, fast forward some years, probably around that time, actually, maybe a year or two before or after, but I knew an Australian politician that mentioned quite casually, again, I didn't really think much of it at the time, how the Americans were pressuring all the English-speaking countries and others, particularly English-speaking countries, to have a treaty between them. And what was this treaty? So that no one could escape paying child support or alimony. So if you're an American, you couldn't go to England or Australia, or and the Americans were most insistent on this. There would be this special treaty to stop people escaping paying alimony. What? And this was very, very important to the Americans. They were absolutely, this is super important. Now, why would you want to have something like that? Excuse me, that's insane. This is the biggest priority. I mean, aren't there bigger priorities in the world? No, this. We can't let those guys get away without paying their full alimony. We're going to have an international treaty and a special international police force to get those motherfuckers. So this is the ideological element of the globalist project, or a manifestation of it. So they're going to hysterical levels because 200 or 300 men got away that they want to pay alimony, and this requires some huge international treaty. Yet there's international slavery involving millions of people, but there's nothing to stop that. But instead, we're going to go after these alimony defaulters, and we're going to lean on a sovereign government and say, you better do this or else. But what was interesting wasn't so much that the Americans asked for this, is what they demanded it with menaces. You better do this or else, you motherfucker. So it was a massively important issue to them, out of all proportion to the actual size of the issue itself. but it represented ideology, it represented gender conflict, and we're not going to let those white men get away with it. We're going to get them. So this ideology coming in that now. So the American state has been using its economic power, economic leverage, its military power, all sorts of things like that to go around threatening, what were once, at least not anymore, but what were once sovereign governments, to say you better do this or else, which includes election rigging, setting up NGOs to spread propaganda. You better do this or we'll have 100 NGOs spreading propaganda. That'll fuck you up. So just do what we want. Trade deals, trade negotiations, all that sort of stuff being used. They'll even blow up gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, for goodness sakes. So all sorts of high-handed, heavy-handed activities, threats of trade embargoes, all sorts of things like that being used against governments, sovereign Western governments, say do this or else. So my view is, given the brutality of that, and I would think the outrageous abuse of trade power and financial power, military power, and so on, I would hope that the Trump presidency would begin to unwind that. You better declare these activist NGOs, you better withdraw charity status from them, or else we're going to put trade embargo. You do the same, use the same levers of power as they did, but to bring it to unwind the globalist reach and the globalist power cartel. And if the Trump presidency is well organized enough and nimble enough and focused enough and clear thinking enough, then I think they can do this, and this will go a long way to unwinding the globalist power cartel, their control of media institutions and so on and so forth. And it's absolutely necessary to again unwind this globalist ideological insanity that's being imposed on us all without our consent. You've been a Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.